On August 29, 1910, Pennsylvania Station opened as a civic monument. In October 1963, its dismantling began in public. But a surviving internal inventory note from the 1963-1966 transition treats parts of the building as assets to be selected and redistributed, meaning the destruction wasn't only physical, it was administrative. This video examines how Pennsylvania Station, an institution as much as a building, was quietly altered in New York City after 1910, and why a single internal record suggests the change was intentional. Not a tragic accident of progress, but a controlled decision that reshaped the city's memory. Here is the controversy in the title, stated plainly. Penn Station did not simply fall. It was dismantled through choices made inside organizations with names, incentives, and authority. The mini-verdict is this: what disappeared was not only stone and steel, but the conditions that would have allowed the public to remember it as more than a transportation problem. To understand why that matters, you have to start with what Penn Station represented when it opened. On August 29, 1910, the original Pennsylvania Station, designed by McKim, Mead, and White for the Pennsylvania Railroad, PRR, was presented as a civic entrance to New York, a public-facing symbol of institutional confidence. In that era, reputation was infrastructure. The city's press culture could elevate a project into legacy or turn it into scandal. And by the mid-20th century, the pressure was different. Modern transit demands, real estate incentives, and corporate balance sheets competing with the idea of a public monument. Then October 1963 arrives, the beginning of the dismantling that the public would later remember as a cultural wound. The familiar story is outrage, photographs, headlines, regret. But the record at the center of this case does not speak in the language of mourning. It reads like management, a piece of internal documentation from the 1963-1966 transition. An inventory item, a transfer note, a storage tag, indicates that components were treated as assets to be selected, categorized, and redistributed, not as debris to be hauled away. That wording matters because it implies chain of custody, and chain of custody implies decision-making. Have you ever encountered a record that wasn't meant to survive? In this film, we will place a 1910 image or plan beside the real path a person walks today through the current Penn Station, measuring, step by step, the contrast between a civic entrance and a subterranean corridor. The tension is not nostalgia. It is evidence. The distance between what was shown publicly and what was decided privately. The case begins when you stop asking what was demolished and start asking what was processed, logged, and reassigned. And it leads to a simple physical question. What exactly was kept, and why does a paper trail still point to it? The answer starts where a label should not exist, and where an archive should have gone silent. And that is where the record begins. The earlier record already told us something the rubble could not. Pieces of Pennsylvania Station were handled as if they still belonged to a system, not as ruins, but as items with custody. To understand how that becomes possible in 1963-1966, you have to move the timeline back to the moment when the institution that owned the station first rewrote what the station was on paper. In 1954, the Pennsylvania Railroad was confronting a problem it could describe cleanly to itself, even if the city could not. The tracks and platforms below street level still mattered to operations. The monumental rooms above them, in corporate terms, could be made to look like overhead, maintenance, staffing, heating, and a public grandeur that did not show up as revenue. That framing does not excuse what followed, but it tells you why the first decisive act is not described in the surviving language as a cultural crisis. It is described as a financial instrument. That year, the Pennsylvania Railroad optioned the air rights over the Penn Station site to real estate developer William Zeckendorf. The phrasing is the evidence. Air rights is an administrative concept that turns an absence into property. Not the building, not the land, but the volume above it, separated from the civic meaning of what stands there. It is a legal idea that allows two realities to coexist in the same place: transportation below, development above, each with its own accounting logic. And once you adopt that language, the station itself is no longer the subject. The right is. The action in this block is translation, performed without drama. The narrator places the 1910 plan and the present-day route on screen, then introduces the 1954 language like a hinge, a point where the station stops being described as a public room and starts being described as a base condition. Optioned the air rights becomes, in plain English, a moment of permission. Someone with authority made it possible to build over the site in a way that did not require defending the station as a monument. The record does not argue against preservation. It simply changes what the decision is about, and by doing that, it changes who the decision belongs to. In corporate chronologies, moves like this can be reduced to a line that reads like routine. One surviving PRR chronology entry from 1954 describes Zeckendorf approving a preliminary offer for a 1-year option to purchase the Penn Station air rights with a $30 million figure attached. Read that aloud and listen for the missing nouns. No marble, no arches, no civic threshold, no public inheritance. The station appears as a site beneath a right, and the right appears as a tool beneath a plan. The decision is present in the structure of the sentence. Value is stated in dollars, consequence is implied, and loss is unnamed. The option also carried an implication that is easy to miss if you only remember the demolition footage from the 1960s. Accounts of the arrangement note that the underground tracks and platforms were not the target. The transformation was about what stood above and how people were routed through it. In other words, the railroad could preserve function while replacing presence. That compromise is not a technical detail. It is the institutional logic that makes later choices easier to justify. If the real station is defined as the transportation machine below, then the monumental spaces can be treated as negotiable packaging, and the record shows how quickly an option becomes direction. By June 1955, preservation histories describe an agreement involving the railroad's president and Zeckendorf that treated the air rights transaction as the rational path toward a rebuilt, below-street station and new revenue above it. The language remains managerial. The station is not defended. It is repositioned. It is presented as a platform for other things: office floors, a sports complex, rentable square footage, structures whose value could be stated without mentioning what had to be removed to make them possible. The effect is subtle but decisive. Once the station is framed as a means to another project, the burden shifts. What must be explained is no longer the loss. What must be explained is the efficiency of the replacement. This is why 1954 matters more than any later headline. An option establishes a future that can be planned for, priced, and slowly normalized. Once a developer can treat the air above the site as negotiable property, every subsequent conversation becomes easier for the institution and harder for the public. The railroad can justify modernization without naming loss. The developer can promote scale and revenue without owning responsibility for the civic subtraction. And officials can talk about zoning, taxes, and traffic patterns while the question of heritage is kept outside the meeting. You can see the displacement even in how contemporary coverage and later summaries frame the proposals. The primary story becomes economic ambition, not the deliberate shrinking of a public entrance into an underground throughput. That is not just public relations. It is risk management in a city where reputation is both fragile and valuable. If you keep the language technical, you keep the timeline long, and you keep the transaction legible, outrage has fewer places to attach itself early enough to change the terms. At what moment does a city lose a building? On the day of rubble, or on the day it becomes just a line on the balance sheet? The consequence is concrete and measurable. Years before any public dismantling begins, the building's fate starts to harden inside paperwork, options, agreements, and the quiet assumption that what stands above the tracks is replaceable. From there, later phases no longer require a fresh moral decision. They require execution, engineering, scheduling, procurement, and a public Explanation calibrated to arrive after the legal groundwork is settled. The delay between the first paper move and the first physical blow is the point. The shock comes later, but the decision happens early. This is also why the 1963-1966 inventory language, the treatment of parts as assets, does not come out of nowhere. A system that learns to describe air as property can learn to describe stone as salvage. A system that learns to separate function from presence can learn to separate public sound. Memory from institutional custody. That is not melodrama, it is workflow. It is how organizations make the irreversible sound ordinary, even to the people signing off on it. Silence is not always enforced with threats. Sometimes it is produced by process. So the investigation tightens around a simple question with a paper answer. After 1954, what changed inside the files? Not what changed in the photographs, and not what changed in the newspapers, but what changed in the categories. How Penn Station was labeled, how its future was recorded, and which words were chosen to make the radical sound routine. The next step is to follow that language forward until the option stops being a possibility and starts behaving like a plan. The way into that next file is not a grand blueprint. It is a typed line, date, amount, initials, where Penn Station appears only as the site beneath a transaction, and the coldest words on the page read like a stamp. Option granted. Between 1958 and 1961, the Penn Station story stops looking like a debate about taste and starts reading like institutional risk management. The air rights logic from the mid-1950s has already pushed the station from building to asset, but what matters here is something quieter. Why, in that moment, even arguing to save the place could be treated as a threat. In Midtown Manhattan, the head house still projects the image of a civic gateway, yet inside the Pennsylvania Railroad that gateway is increasingly described as an obligation that must justify itself in financial terms. The railroad does not need to persuade New Yorkers that beauty is worthless. It only needs to move the argument into categories where beauty cannot win. That is where elite practice lives. Governance, committees, boards, and a controlled vocabulary that turns a civic inheritance into a cost center. In that system, the question is not, should we preserve, but what are we obligated to carry? Words like modernization, efficiency, and reconfiguration are not decoration. They translate a public landmark into a managerial problem, and they do it in a way that reduces personal accountability. If the issue is efficiency, then no one is destroying anything. They are fulfilling a duty. A concrete step happens before any wrecking ball. The station is rhetorically reclassified. The narrator reconstructs how the argument is assembled, because it follows a repeatable pattern institutions use when they need the public to accept loss as inevitability. First comes a controlled concession. The building is acknowledged as beautiful, historic, admired. Then the concession is neutralized by the pivot. It does not pay the bill. Next, the field is narrowed. The city needs speed, circulation, throughput. The future demands another scale. Finally, the conclusion arrives as if it were forced by math rather than chosen by people. Change is pragmatic, opposition is emotional, preservation is nostalgic. Even the building's condition becomes usable inside that containment strategy. Accounts of late 1950s alterations describe how the monumental experience was reduced. Grand columns covered, a major hall blocked by a new ticket office, advertisements and commercial insertions crowding what had once read as civic rooms. That matters because it shifts the burden of proof. A degraded landmark is harder to defend, and a harder defense raises the reputational price for the people making decisions. The building can be made to feel less sacred before anyone is asked to accept that it will be gone. By 1961, the internal pressure inside the Pennsylvania Railroad sharpens the risk calculus. A surviving PRR chronology notes that on July 1, 1961, a continuing recession produced a first-half loss of $18 million. Numbers like that do not create patience. They create timelines. They trigger restructurings and, efficiency programs meant to reassure boards, lenders, and regulators that management is decisive. The wider passenger rail environment also offers cover for hard choices because it makes loss feel systemic rather than managerial. Contemporary policy writing made that pressure legible in numbers that executives could cite without sounding cruel. One widely cited figure is the scale of passenger losses. In 1961, U.S. railroads were described as running a passenger deficit in the hundreds of millions of dollars, a context that made asset monetization sound like stewardship rather than abandonment. Within the Pennsylvania Railroad itself, sources describe a shift toward relying more heavily on real estate value in the 1950s, which meant that the station's symbolic meaning competed directly with its value as a platform for the next revenue strategy. And there is a legal asymmetry that sharpens the reputational risk. Before New York adopted its modern preservation framework in 1965, opponents had fewer formal tools to compel protection, while the railroad could treat redevelopment as ordinary corporate planning. In that setting, Save Penn Station can be recast as force the railroad to absorb costs, and the recasting is the point. Once the argument is about fiscal discipline, the institution can present itself as competent, even while it dismantles a civic threshold. In internal terms, the risk is not only money, it is legitimacy. If Penn Station is framed as heritage, then maintenance becomes a public interest issue. But if maintenance is a public interest issue, every prior decision about upkeep becomes fair game. That is why the prohibitive cost argument is so useful in this window. It converts stewardship into arithmetic, carrying costs, capital needs, and balance sheet pressure, rather than a question of public meaning. It also has another advantage. Arithmetic can be handled by committees, summarized in board materials, and delivered to the public in language that looks objective. Heritage, by contrast, forces names and choices into view. This is where the New York Times becomes more than a newspaper. It is an arena of legitimacy, the place where arguments are tested, reputations are scored, and institutions learn what kind of explanation will be accepted without paying the full reputational cost. The Penn Station record shows both sides using the Times as a battleground, critics trying to force moral language into view, and institutional voices answering with technical language that keeps agency blurred. A sentence can be written so no one is the actor. Maintenance is prohibitive, redevelopment is necessary. The future requires a new station. That style matters because it trains the reader to treat demolition as an outcome rather than an act. In 1958-1961, saving the building is dangerous for reasons that go beyond city politics. It is dangerous because it threatens to expose governance in a cultural forum. If Penn Station is treated as civic heritage, then neglect becomes a story. If neglect becomes a story, stewardship becomes a test. And if stewardship becomes a test, the institution risks looking financially incompetent in public at precisely the moment it needs to look disciplined. It is also dangerous because it risks creating precedent. If one private institution is pressured into preserving a public monument at its own expense, others may be next. That is not how boards and committees talk about architecture. That is how they talk about risk. The action in this block, then, is disciplined construction of argument. The narrator shows how the case is packaged so dissent carries social cost. Preservation is framed as sentimentality. Opposition is framed as hostility to progress. Civic value is framed as nostalgia. Meanwhile, the institution's preferred terms operate like shields because they translate cultural loss into managerial duty. And when duty becomes the frame, silence becomes easy to justify. You do not need to announce demolition. You only need to keep repeating that the future is efficiency and that anything else is irresponsible. The consequence is real and measurable. Once this framing takes hold, the future becomes harder to interrupt. Alternatives are made to sound naive, timelines are normalized, and solutions are presented as fiscal adulthood rather than choice. When the later, louder moments finally arrive, the public experiences shock, but the institution experiences implementation. The risk decisions have already been processed inside governance, committee, language, and accounting categories. So the surviving traces from 1958-1961 do not read like melodrama. They read like an organization protecting itself from the scandal of admitting it is trading a civic threshold for revenue and control. The next file we have to open is the one where neutral terms harden into policy, where efficiency stops being rhetoric and becomes a line item, and where Penn Station appears under a colder label that fits comfortably on a balance sheet. It is a typed page with a familiar corporate heading, and beneath it, one phrase that doesn't describe a monument at all: non-operating real estate, aligned on the same line as Pennsylvania Station. By the time the public hears the plan in 1962, the argument has already been compressed into something that can survive scrutiny in the most unforgiving place: the institutional record. The phrase "a new Penn" is not an architectural promise first, it is a management promise. It signals that the Pennsylvania Railroad has selected a solution that preserves flow and revenue, even if it sacrifices the above-ground form that once made the station a civic entrance. In the prior blocks, we watched the language slide from civic meaning to accounting meaning. Here, that slide becomes a decision with names attached to it. This posture change does not arrive as a confession. It arrives as an announcement engineered to look inevitable. The mechanics are legible even when the paperwork that survives is selective because the roles are clear. The Pennsylvania Railroad holds the site and the operational constraint. Trains must keep moving through Midtown Manhattan, regardless of what happens above. Madison Square Garden, under Irving Mitchell Felt, holds the incentive. Place a high-revenue venue over a central transit footprint without inheriting the cultural liability of the building underneath. Graham Page sits between these interests as the corporate structure that makes the arrangement look orderly on paper, like a rational redevelopment instead of an institutional retreat. The action in this block is administrative, not emotional, and it follows a pattern institutions favor precisely because it distributes responsibility. First comes internal authorization. Inside the railroad's governance, Penn Station stops being treated as a public room and is treated as machinery that must remain operational while the surface above it is repurposed. You can hear the decision in the phrasing that tends to appear around arrangements like this: reconfiguration, modern passenger facilities, improved circulation, efficient use of the site. Even when the exact memorandum is missing, the logic it serves is consistent. The tracks and platforms below are framed as the obligation. Everything above becomes negotiable. That reclassification is the decision in its most honest form. It allows boards, committees, and council to approve a plan that preserves throughput while converting the superstructure into an opportunity. Second comes external legitimization. The announcement is framed so that disagreement can be dismissed as sentimentality rather than treated as a competing plan. The promise of a replacement, a new Penn, does essential work. It lets the railroad claim continuity while changing the category of what the station is. If the public can be led to accept that the station is primarily a service function, then the loss of civic scale becomes a secondary matter, something that can be regretted without stopping the project. That is why the announcement is not built around what will be lost. It is built around what will be delivered. Listen to what this kind of release avoids saying. It does not say, "We are sacrificing a symbol." It does not say, "We are replacing a civic gateway with a privately controlled complex." It does not say, "We are choosing revenue over form." Instead, it says, "We are modernizing. We are improving circulation. We are meeting future needs. We are solving a practical problem." The vocabulary is technical because technical language spreads agency across a system. A committee recommends, council reviews, a board approves, an executive signs, a partner commits. No single person has to stand in front of the city and say, plainly, that a monumental entrance will be treated as surplus. This is where Irving Mitchell Felt matters, not as a caricature, but as a function. Felt does not need to argue against Penn Station's heritage and public. He only needs to present Madison Square Garden as a civic improvement. Growth, jobs, prestige, modern scale, an arena that sounds like the city's future rather than the railroad's liquidation strategy. He can speak in the language of opportunity, while the railroad speaks in the language of necessity. Graham Page provides the intermediate posture that keeps the arrangement legible to finance and respectable to officials, and the railroad can then present itself as responsible, not abandoning the traveling public, but upgrading the experience in a way that fits a new era. In 1962, legitimacy hardens into something more dangerous than persuasion: schedule. Once the plan is public and attached to named partners, Pennsylvania Railroad, Madison Square Garden, Graham Page, it stops being a theoretical debate and becomes a calendar with dependencies. A press release is not just communication, it is a marker that internal authorization has already occurred and that the institution is now defending execution, not exploring options. From that moment, every objection runs into the same wall: commitments that now exist on paper. What was once an argument about whether the city should accept the trade becomes an argument about whether the city can still interrupt it. The narrator reconstructs the engineering of the announcement by focusing on who must authorize and who only needs to appear. Inside the railroad, someone must accept the exchange explicitly, preserve the machine, sacrifice the form. That is a decision even when it is written as efficiency. Inside the garden structure, someone must secure the right to build above a central transit artery while keeping the cultural cost outside the project's formal scope. Corporate vehicles are not incidental here. They are part of the insulation. They hold obligations, channel profits, and convert a civic controversy into a transaction with clean edges. There is also a practical condition the announcement depends on, and it is the condition that makes the decision survivable in public. The station can be reduced while trains continue to run. If service can be maintained, the institution can argue it has met its duty. The civic experience becomes optional, and what is optional can be sacrificed. This is the explicit exchange at the heart of 1962. Symbol for machine, public threshold for throughput, entrance for circulation. The promise of a new pen smooths that exchange by implying equivalence where there is only substitution. It trains the audience to measure success in operational terms. Can you buy a ticket? Can you get to the platform? Rather than civic terms, what kind of city does this place claim to be? The decision also changes how accountability works. Before an announcement, institutions can claim that nothing is final. After an announcement, they can claim that reversal is unrealistic. The same machinery that spreads responsibility during authorization now protects the outcome. During controversy, the railroad can point to the necessity of modernization and the pressure of operations. The garden can point to investment, jobs, and the logic of development. Graham Page can point to contracts and corporate process, and the city is left arguing in a narrowed lane because the plan has been defined in the language of inevitability. The consequence is institutional, not aesthetic. After 1962, power shifts. The people who can slow the plan are no longer the ones who can prove the station's value. They are the ones who can interrupt the schedule. That is a different kind of fight, and it favors entities that already operate through boards, committees, contracts, and council. It also changes what becomes sensitive in the archive. Once a plan is announced, the most dangerous question is no longer whether it is right. It is whether it was framed honestly. Because if the framing is exposed as a deliberate narrowing, if modernization is shown to be a protective word, then the decision stops looking like necessity and starts looking like governance. That is why, in retrospect, the 1962 announcement feels colder than the later images of stone being hauled away. The later images show destruction. The announcement shows control. It shows the moment the institution stops negotiating with the city and starts managing the city's reaction. It shows how a promise can be used as a solvent. New pen dissolves the moral weight of old pen by turning loss into replacement. And it shows how a public symbol can be handled as a project layer. Keep the operational core, monetize the space above, and let the public argue about the surface while the structure underneath is already committed. And that is where the investigation tightens. The 1962 announcement tells the city what will happen. The surviving internal traces tell us how it was made safe to say. The next step is to locate the specific point where plan becomes authorized. The line where Penn Station is no longer discussed as a public room at all, but as redevelopment substrate that can be scheduled, valued, and traded without naming what disappears. The image that closes this block is almost banal. A 1962 date line at the top of a typed page. The names Pennsylvania Railroad, Madison Square Garden, and Graham Page, aligned as if they were merely partners in progress, and beneath them a single approving signature that makes the phrase "a new Penn" read like continuity, while the old station's fate becomes an item already moved from debate into execution. On October 28, 1963, demolition began on Pennsylvania Station. The newspapers called it construction, but what unfolded was an act of controlled erasure, broadcast, photographed, and approved under the supervision of the same institutions that had once described the building as a civic monument. The contractor Lipset, known for large-scale industrial dismantling, was brought in to carry out what internal schedules framed as site clearance. The Pennsylvania Railroad and Madison Square Garden Center, Inc. had already secured the necessary permissions. What was being removed officially were obsolete superstructures. What was being erased in practice was the most visible piece of the city's collective vocabulary. The action was literal. Stone was cut, iron hauled, glass shattered under daylight. But the deeper alteration happened in real time, as the meaning of the building changed while it was still standing. The temple-like concourse, once defined by light and vertical proportion, became a visual experiment in subtraction. Workers began by removing the copper roof sections, which let daylight flood in at unnatural angles. Columns, once vertical symbols of stability, became temporary scaffolds, severed mid-shaft before being lowered to trucks. The grand staircases, documented by photographers for decades, were cordoned off and turned into staging areas for debris. Each removal altered how people moved through the remaining structure, forcing commuters into narrower corridors, where the monumental scale was reduced to fragments of utility. The public, forced to reroute daily through what was effectively an active demolition site, adapted with surprising speed. That adaptation was part of the experiment. Once the roof panels and clear-story windows were gone, the spatial hierarchy collapsed. The hall no longer felt civic. It felt temporary. The Lipset crews operated with precision, cutting through marble like it was industrial scrap. Their contracts describe this not as destruction but as material recovery. The word matters. It implies continuity, process, value retention. It is also the linguistic counterpart to the financial strategy that had justified the demolition, the transformation of a landmark into material inventory. The narrator lingers on one specific physical detail to measure what was lost: light. In the original 1910 design, natural light entered through the glass and iron vault, diffused across travertine, and settled into a calm rhythm that made time feel visible. By late 1963, that rhythm had been replaced by the dull orange of temporary lamps strung along plywood partitions. Commuters walking through the remains of the concourse no longer lifted their gaze. The architecture that once invited reverence now instructed efficiency. The change was behavioral before it was complete. In that moment, the Pennsylvania Railroad achieved what its board could never have written in a memorandum. The station stopped being an experience and became a passage. Between 1963 and 1966, the site evolved in phases that followed the same principle: preserve the underground machine, delete the civic shell. Lipset's men dismantled the upper structure while trains still ran below, separated by temporary flooring and noise barriers. It was a logistical triumph presented as modernization, but from a heritage perspective, it was the functionalization of memory. The building's physical demise mirrored the institutional logic that had set it in motion years earlier. Efficiency as justification, progress as alibi. Even the demolition's visual chaos was managed into order, steel beams numbered, columns tagged, stone catalogued for removal. Each object that left the site was entered into a record, the same way the 1963-1966 internal inventory had classified fragments as assets. The consequence was social as much as spatial. The city lost more than a landmark. It lost the habit of civic awe. A space that once slowed people down now trained them to keep moving. The new, predominantly subterranean Penn Station, born from this transition, no longer offered a sense of arrival. It became a threshold designed to minimize attention. And once the public adjusted to that compression, to the lower ceilings, fluorescent light, mechanical hum, the absence of grandeur stopped feeling like loss. It began to feel normal. The psychological adjustment was complete long before the demolition finished. In a city calibrated for velocity, stillness had become obsolete. By 1966, the last traces of the McKim, Mead White design were gone. The official photographs show a clean platform where the Madison Square Garden complex would soon rise. The civic vocabulary of columns, arches, and daylight was replaced with escalators, signage, and concession stands. What had been built as a monument to arrival became a machine for throughput, perfectly aligned with the priorities that had guided its destruction. Maximize circulation, monetize space, reduce friction. The alteration was total, physical, linguistic, and perceptual. If the public adapts too quickly, what exactly has been lost? And who benefits from that speed? The question lingers not as sentiment, but as record. In the city's archives, the same day that the demolition began is recorded as the date of project initiation. On paper, the destruction reads as a beginning, not an end. That inversion tells you everything about how institutions manage history, and the image that closes this block is stark. A 1963 photograph showing a lone column, half-severed, standing amid scaffolding. Behind it, commuters hurry past, eyes fixed forward. No one looks up. The light that once defined the station now leaks through holes in the roof, sharp, accidental, almost indifferent. It is the last moment when the building is both present and disappearing, a structure turning into transit before anyone realizes it already has. By 1964, the logic behind Penn Station's destruction had already moved from plan to practice, and the silence surrounding it had become a functional asset. Every institution involved, Graham Page, Madison Square Garden, and the Pennsylvania Railroad, found a way to translate loss into continuity, or more precisely, into revenue. The demolition no longer needed justification, it needed management. What began as an exchange between symbol and machine became a redistribution of value across the city's hierarchy of influence. Inside this redistribution, each beneficiary occupies a distinct layer. At the base sits the Pennsylvania Railroad, an institution once defined by physical infrastructure, but now pressed to monetize what it still owned. Its leadership framed the conversion not as a liquidation, but as strategic adaptation. When the Lipset demolition crews advanced through the steel vaults of the old concourse, they weren't only clearing space. They were executing a financial maneuver that had been in preparation for nearly a decade. The stone and steel that once stood for civic permanence were now instruments in a survival equation. Land leveraged, air sold, rights subdivided. The immediate gain for the railroad was liquidity without total exit. It retained subterranean control, tracks, platforms, rights of way, while transferring the profitable vertical domain to partners who could build and operate at a higher commercial scale. In other words, the railroad stayed essential but invisible. Its duty to the public shifted from stewardship to throughput. Keep the trains running, but let others extract rent from the air above. That redefinition stabilized its balance sheet for a short time and, perhaps more importantly, allowed its leadership to claim technical responsibility rather than cultural guilt. At the surface level, the Madison Square Garden Corporation, under Irving Mitchell Felt, captured the more visible rewards. By 1964, Construction on the new garden complex had already turned the demolition site into a future statement of modernity. Offices, arena, retail, circulation. The institution positioned itself as the inheritor of the civic mantle it helped erase, and its public relations reflected that inversion perfectly. The language of innovation stood where the language of heritage had been. A new Penn Station was no longer an act of replacement. It was marketed as progress itself. Revenues. Projections from arena events and adjacent real estate justified the loss of grandeur with the arithmetic of occupancy rates and ticket sales. Graham Page, operating as the corporate intermediary, provided the structure that insulated both the railroad and the garden from direct political fallout. Its financial reporting between 1964 and 1965 illustrates how institutional architecture can be as decisive as physical architecture. Separate entities, cross-held shares, and layered ownership made it difficult for the public to identify a single responsible actor. That opacity was not accidental. It created a field where silence could perform as strategy, where questions about who profited could be answered with procedural language about boards, subsidiaries, and leases. This was not the silence of ignorance, it was the silence of coordination. The few public statements issued by the garden or the railroad during this phase are remarkable for their tonal consistency. They avoid adjectives. They avoid memory. They are written as if demolition were maintenance. Phrases like redevelopment of the Penn Plaza area, modernization of facilities, and continuity of service reframe an act of erasure as an upgrade in management. The very grammar of those sentences serves the beneficiaries. No subjects performing destruction, only systems advancing. The financial outcomes reinforce the structure of gain. Madison Square Garden secured long-term leases and revenue streams from its new arena, commercial offices, and retail tenants. Graham Page and its investors captured returns from the repositioned property portfolio. The Pennsylvania Railroad, while still struggling operationally, stabilized enough of its asset base to delay collapse for several years. Each institution's incentive aligned around the same principle: maximize rentable surface, minimize public friction. In that alignment, the city's skyline became a register of institutional logic. The vertical was profitable, the horizontal sentimental. And there is a subtler form of profit, one less visible than financial statements can show: narrative control. By 1965, as preservationists began to mobilize and the first stirrings of the Landmarks Preservation Commission emerged, the beneficiaries of Penn Station's demise had already secured the dominant frame. Modernization was a word no official wanted to oppose publicly. It sounded responsible, contemporary, adult. To challenge it was to risk appearing regressive or naive. The city's own sense of legitimacy was tied to motion, to progress, to avoiding the image of stagnation. In that atmosphere, the silence surrounding the true beneficiaries functioned as armor. The absence of outrage was not evidence of acceptance. It was the byproduct of institutional saturation. Each participant occupied a legitimate position in the civic ecosystem: transport, development, investment, governance, and each could point to another as the origin of necessity. The railroad pointed to financial strain. The garden pointed to opportunity. The city pointed to growth. No one had to defend the trade explicitly because everyone could claim to be reacting to something larger. The social consequence of that dynamic is still visible in the footage from 1964. Commuters navigating plywood tunnels beneath half-demolished vaults, moving through the ruins of what had been a civic ritual without pause or protest. Their behavior is evidence of how effectively the new order absorbed disruption. People adapted to the altered space as if the monumental hall had never existed. That adaptation was the final profit, a public that internalized the loss so quickly that resistance became impractical. If the audience for heritage learns to move on before the dust settles, then silence becomes the most reliable form of consent. Have you ever noticed how fast a city forgets when forgetting helps it function? By 1965, when the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission was finally formed, the economic momentum around the Penn Station site had already hardened into precedent. The beneficiaries' gains were secure, their narratives normalized, and their structures legally insulated. The reform arrived as a moral afterimage, a recognition that something irreversible had been traded away. But for those inside the 1964-1965 window, the outcome was not tragedy. It was resolution. The machine was intact. The rents were flowing. The debate was over. The block ends not with an outcry, but with a notation, one that survives in corporate filings and press archives alike. Pennsylvania Station, redevelopment complete. A sentence stripped of emotion, but full of consequence. The symbol had been liquidated, and the silence that followed was not absence. It was evidence of victory. By 1966, the argument was no longer about whether Penn Station could be saved. The monumental version was already gone in any meaningful sense, and what remained above ground was not a station you entered so much as a project you passed through. The disappearance did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened as a sequence of removals that changed how the public behaved, and therefore what the place was allowed to mean. The loss that matters here is not only material, it is the loss of a civic ritual that used to happen automatically, without signage or instruction. If you want proof, you don't need a speech or a plaque. You need a test. Walk the modern station the way an investigator would in a field exercise, starting from street level, trying to reach a platform without relying on habit or prior knowledge. Notice what the building asks you to do. It asks you to read. It asks you to follow. It asks you to accept compression as normal. And it asks you to treat the journey as a series of corrections rather than a single legible movement. Now put a 1910 photograph or plan on the screen beside that walk. In 1910, the station's design did not require you to hunt for meaning. It delivered it. The height, the light, the proportions, all of it told you where you were and what kind of space you had entered. You did not navigate Penn Station in the modern sense. You arrived, and the architecture did the orientation for you. The city did not need to convince you that this was an institution. The building made the claim, quietly, every day. By contrast, once the above-ground monumental rooms had been dismantled, the station's core experience became something else. Corridors, ticketing zones, split paths, controlled flows. That is the first concrete thing that disappears between 1966 and 1968, the right of arrival. Not the ability to enter, but the feeling that entering mattered. When a place is built like a civic threshold, it gives people a moment of pause, a moment where public life feels legitimate, where you are not just moving, but participating in a shared urban order. When that threshold is removed, the public's adjust faster than it realizes. The body learns to hurry, the eyes learn to scan for instructions, the mind learns that the space is not there to host you, only to process you. The second disappearance is harder to describe until you've done the walk. Spatial legibility. In the old station, you could infer direction. You could recognize hierarchy. The grand spaces were grand for a reason, and the movement through them followed a logic that felt intuitive even to a first-time visitor. In the post-demolition logic, orientation becomes a service that has to be provided by systems, signs, boards, arrows, temporary partitions, because the architecture no longer carries the narrative. That changes the social contract. When the building itself cannot guide you, your dependence shifts to management. You become a user of instructions rather than a citizen of a place. This is not a poetic complaint. It is a measurable alteration in how a public behaves. In a space that reads as institutional, people tend to hold themselves differently. They slow, they look up, they find their bearings. They understand which spaces are for waiting, which are for movement, which are for gathering. In a space defined by compression and signage, behavior becomes defensive. Movement becomes tactical. The station becomes a problem to solve, repeated daily. The experience may be efficient on paper, but it is costly in perception, especially around dignity and safety. A place that forces constant micro-decisions creates stress. And stress changes how the public treats itself. Less patience, less courtesy, more suspicion, more hurry. The third disappearance is the most consequential in an institutional sense. The loss of public institution as a felt reality in the center of transit. This is where Madison Square Garden becomes more than a building above the station. It becomes a shift in gravity. The old Penn Station presented itself as a civic room that happened to contain transportation. The new logic presents transportation as a utility embedded beneath a commercial and entertainment complex. The hierarchy flips. What sits above holds the prestige and the revenue. What sits below holds the obligation and the crowd. By 1968, when the Penn Station, in its reopened form, is operating under this new logic, the substitution is complete at the level that matters most. Not what the station does, but what the station is allowed to represent. The reopened station can still move people. It can still sell tickets. It can still deliver trains. But it does not grant the commuter a civic experience. It grants a route. It does not frame travel as a public act in a dignified environment. It frames travel as throughput inside a managed container. That difference is why the disappearance is not only aesthetic. It is a redefinition of what New York is willing to provide at the center of its movement. The action in this block is the walkthrough as evidence. The narrator performs it plainly, without exaggeration. Street level, entry, first decision point, second decision point, ticketing area, corridor, stairwell, another sign, another correction. The camera does not hunt for drama. It lets the environment reveal its own priorities. Then the narrator holds the 1910 plan or photo in the frame and marks what is missing in practical terms. Not beauty, but usable clarity, the kind of space where you know, instinctively, where to go and how to behave. Then, as a final measure, the narrator describes the human effect of losing that clarity. The station becomes a place you endure rather than inhabit. And that is where the disappearance becomes investigatively useful. Because a disappearance of this kind, ritual, legibility, institutional feeling, does not happen as collateral damage alone. It happens because it serves something. It serves the new center of gravity above. It serves the need to keep circulation continuous while construction proceeds. It serves commercial priorities that prefer people in motion, spending, not lingering in a civic room. Convenience is not neutral here. Convenience is a design mandate that has beneficiaries. There is also a timing detail that matters for the record. By 1966, the monumental experience is already functionally extinct, even if fragments, photos, and salvage remain. That is the year when the loss becomes irreversible in lived reality, not because the last stone is removed, but because the public's behavior has adapted to the new conditions. Once that adaptation happens, the institution no longer needs to defend the old station's purpose. The public stops demanding it in the same terms, because it can no longer remember the feeling as a daily norm. This is how disappearance becomes durable, not by erasing every trace, but by replacing the routine that made the trace meaningful. So the consequence is not only that a temple became a basement. The consequence is that an entire category of urban belonging became harder to claim. When a city removes its most legible public thresholds and replaces them with spaces optimized for movement and consumption, it trains its population to accept smaller civic expectations. That training becomes a precedent, and by 1968 the precedent is installed. A station can be called Penn Station, even if it no longer behaves like the institution that name once described. And this is why the next stage of the investigation cannot stay in photographs or memories. We have to follow what happens when a disappearance becomes administratively normal, when the new conditions are documented in vague institutional language, when the old experience is referenced as obsolete, when the replacement is recorded as improvement, and when the paperwork treats the loss as resolved. The image that closes this block is the simplest possible proof of substitution, a 1968 directional sign that says Penn Station, bolted above a low corridor, while a 1910 photograph beside it shows a vaulted hall flooded with light, two labels for the same name, and no document in the public-facing record that admits what was amputated to make the second one fit. If you stop the story in 1968, the loss looks complete. A sign that still says Penn Station, bolted above a low corridor, while the 1910 image beside it shows a vaulted hall that no longer exists. But if you move backward just a few years, you hit a contradiction that should not be possible in a city that prides itself on governance. New York creates protection, yet the most obvious candidate for protection is dismantled anyway. The inconsistency is not philosophical, it is administrative, and it has dates. On April 21, 1962, Mayor Robert F. Wagner, Jr. formally establishes the Landmarks Preservation Commission. In the public mind, that sounds like a switch being flipped. The city is now equipped to defend its own inheritance. It sounds like the moment when a building, like Penn Station, would become untouchable. And yet the first physical dismantling begins in October 1963, with the redevelopment machine already committed to a new Madison Square Garden over the site. The public hears commission and imagines authority. The record of what follows reveals something else, a body that can identify, advise, and warn, without the legal force to stop an institution that already has contracts, partners, and momentum. That is the paradox this case exposes. Creating a commission is a political act. Stopping a legal financial redevelopment apparatus is a different category of act entirely. In the early 1960s, those categories were not aligned. The city could form a commission and still be structurally incapable of forcing a reversal, because the decisive commitments around Penn Station were not being made inside municipal preservation law. They were being made through corporate governance, property rights, and redevelopment agreements that had already hardened into schedules. To see the inconsistency clearly, you have to treat protection as a sequence of verbs, not a single noun. What could the city do in 1962? It could convene. It could recommend. It could begin designating landmarks. It could issue statements. It could create a visible center for preservation politics. But what it could not reliably do, yet, was freeze a private redevelopment that was already legitimized by deals and defended as necessity. That gap between visibility and force is the entire story in miniature. Now look at the timing that makes the contradiction feel almost engineered. In 1962, the redevelopment plan is already in a stage where it can be announced as inevitable. Partners named, a new Penn promised, the sacrifice framed as necessity. In 1963, the dismantling begins. In April 1965, the city's landmarks law is enacted as a stronger, enforceable instrument. These are not just milestones, they are misaligned gears. By the time the city builds a legal mechanism strong enough to compel preservation, the machine it would need to stop has already crossed the point where institutions can claim reversal would be irresponsible. Too expensive, too disruptive, too legally complicated. The city's response arrives in the window when outrage is visible but leverage is limited. This is where the inconsistency becomes investigatively useful, because it forces a sharper question than, why didn't they care? The question becomes, what did care look like? When it had no teeth, and who benefited from that gap? The early commission gave the city a way to signal moral intent without incurring the full institutional cost of enforcement. It created a public-facing posture. New York is now a city that preserves, while leaving the private apparatus of redevelopment largely intact. That is not cynicism. It is how systems behave when legitimacy and power are out of sync. A commission can absorb pressure. A law can block deals. Those are different functions. In 1962, the city had more of the first than the second. In this block, the narrator reconstructs the administrative paradox in plain terms, using Penn Station as the test case. The camera holds on the two images from the previous sequence, the 1910 hall and the later corridor. Then the narrator lays the dates over them as if they were labels in a file. April 21st, 1962, commission formed. October 1963, dismantling begins. April 1965, landmarks law becomes enforceable authority. The question is not asked as outrage. It's asked like an audit. How can protection exist in civic language while the most visible loss proceeds in real space. The answer sits in the difference between institutional existence and statutory power, and the case makes that difference unusually clear. A commission is a structure: appointments, meetings, reports, public legitimacy. A law is a lever: enforceable constraints, procedural requirements, the ability to delay or block. In the Penn Station window, the city builds the structure first and the lever later. Meanwhile, the redevelopment process operates on its own clock: boards, contracts, financing, construction logistics, where each new step creates the argument that it is now too late to stop. The narrator demonstrates that gap without dramatizing it. First, the existence of the commission is treated as a political move, an attempt to formalize preservation as a civic value. Then the camera shifts to the other apparatus operating at the same time: corporate decision chains, redevelopment commitments, the promise of continuous transit service. One apparatus produces legitimacy, the other produces outcomes. When those two run on different timelines, the public is left with a symbol of action while the decision-making engine keeps turning. And that is where the inconsistency becomes more than historical irony. It becomes a warning about timing. In city governance, a rule's existence can be used as a substitute for a rule's application. Commission's formation can reassure the public that someone is watching, even when the watcher cannot intervene in a way that changes the result. This can happen without a single villain, because systems prefer solutions that reduce conflict without forcing institutions to reverse course. Do you trust more in the existence of a rule or in the moment it is actually applied? By April 1965, the Landmarks Law changes the structure of the problem. Preservation becomes enforceable and future Penn Stations become harder to dismantle without a fight that has legal standing. But Penn Station itself remains the exhibit that proves the inconsistency. The city could name preservation as a value in 1962 and still lose its most visible symbol because power arrived late relative to the deal's life cycle. The result is that the station becomes a civic lesson encoded in law. Preservation in New York is born not as a confident principle but as a delayed response to an institutional defeat. The consequence is institutional and cultural at once. Penn Station becomes the case that reveals how protection can be constructed as public posture before it exists as functional barrier. It also becomes a template for how cities manage regret, codify the lesson, celebrate the reform, and allow the original loss to harden into inevitability. The city does not erase the wound, it legislates around it. And that legislative act, while genuine, carries the trace of its timing. It arrives like a formal admission that the city did not have the leverage it needed when the decision that mattered was being made. The block ends with a concrete administrative image that holds the contradiction in one frame. A dated municipal announcement from April 21, 1962, establishing the commission, placed beside an April 1965 legal instrument that finally grants real authority, while between them the redevelopment schedule continues to run as if the space where Penn Station stood were already being treated as a completed fact rather than an open question. By January of 1963, the demolition of Penn Station was no longer an internal plan. It was a pending public act, and that visibility, for the first time, made it dangerous. When the Pennsylvania Railroad secured its final authorizations and the new Madison Square Garden project began to move from paperwork to construction schedules, what had been treated as modernization turned into a moral test. The risk was not simply financial or logistical anymore. It was reputational. If the decision became visible in the wrong way, the institutions behind it risked being remembered not as pragmatic stewards of a city's infrastructure, but as the authors of an act of civic vandalism. The word vandalism entered the public conversation that same year, and it did not come from radicals. It came from editorial desks and cultural voices that rarely use such language about domestic institutions. The New York Times, which had previously covered the redevelopment in neutral managerial tones, shifted in January 1963 toward something closer to alarm. The editorials began to describe the project not as urban progress, but as a profound error in the management of civic identity. This change mattered because it reframed the act. A demolition could be explained away as modernization, but vandalism required an agent. It implied responsibility. For the Pennsylvania Railroad, that word was the real threat. A public company could absorb the loss of a building. It could not as easily absorb the permanent loss of legitimacy. Once demolition began, photographs would circulate internationally. Correspondents in Europe would write about the destruction of a Beaux-Arts monument as if it were a moral scandal, not a zoning story. And the moment that coverage spread, New York risked becoming the symbol of a city captured by private interest, a metropolis willing to liquidate its civic inheritance for balance sheet convenience. In this window between January and October 1963, the dynamics of scandal evolved almost in real time. The narrator reconstructs it as a sequence of escalation. Early that year, the railroad's internal communications emphasized compliance, engineering, and safety. Publicly, the line was still redevelopment, a euphemism that implied continuity rather than rupture. But by mid-year, the pressure outside those walls intensified. Architects, critics, and civic figures began to organize, not as a political opposition, but as a cultural counterweight. Letters to the editor multiplied. Words like sacrilege, indignity, and loss appeared in mainstream outlets. The tone shifted from curiosity to accusation. In October 1963, when the first demolition crews from the Lipset Company began dismantling the roof spans, the images validated every warning. The photographs that hit the newspapers did not show abstract progress. They showed daylight breaking through iron vaults, marble being cut apart, workers standing on what used to be a civic temple. For a brief period, Penn Station turned into an inadvertent theater of accountability, a live demonstration of how far a city could go in rebranding destruction as modernization. What made this episode dangerous for those in charge was not that protesters might stop the work. The contracts were too advanced, the authorizations too layered. The danger was the moral contagion of the story itself, the possibility that Penn Station would become AE, shorthand for bureaucratic arrogance and civic amnesia. Inside City Hall, the administration of Mayor Wagner faced a different kind of pressure, the fear that the same narrative could attach to the city's leadership. Officials had not ordered the demolition directly, but they had allowed it. Their proximity to the event was enough to make them politically vulnerable. And this is the heart of the risk. When institutions depend on legitimacy, the greatest threat is not exposure of a crime, but exposure of indifference. The spectacle of demolition transformed indifference into something visible. Cameras captured the transition from grandeur to debris, and that visibility acted like a mirror for the city's conscience. Every column that fell became a metaphor too precise to dismiss. Every photograph invited comparison with a funeral for public dignity. The New York Times eventually published what would become the definitive line of the scandal, that we will probably be judged not by the monuments we build, but by those we have destroyed. That sentence did not halt the demolition, but it did something more lasting. It made Penn Station a permanent reference point for civic failure. From that point forward, every major urban redevelopment carried with it a new variable, the fear of being the next Penn Station. The institutions understood this quickly. By late 1963, the tone of official communication changed again. Where the first press materials had described a new Penn, later, releases became cautious, focusing on service continuity and economic benefit. The language became defensive, scrubbed of optimism. It was no longer about celebration, it was about containment. The risk had evolved from outrage to memory management. This is the paradox of the scandal. It did not stop the event, but it permanently altered the behavior of those who witnessed it from the inside. Executives and city officials learned that cultural backlash, even when it arrives too late, can still shape how future deals are written, how announcements are timed, and how losses are justified. The legacy of Penn Station's demolition, in that sense, is not just the law that followed in 1965, it is the institutional reflex that followed in 1964. To make sure that no single name, date, or photograph could ever again serve as the emblem of a civic betrayal. The consequence is historical and psychological. After 1963, The fear of being remembered replaced the fear of being wrong. Urban authorities learned to design their decisions so that accountability was distributed across layers, boards, committees, agencies, ensuring that when controversy arose, no one person could be singled out as the author of destruction. The city's cultural sphere learned the opposite lesson, that outrage must precede the event, not follow it. By the end of 1963, preservation had not yet gained legal power, but it had gained rhetorical power. Penn Station had become more than a place. It was a warning, a metaphor, a category of shame. The narrator closes this block by contrasting two documents. The official permit for demolition issued early in 1963, signed and procedural, and the editorial clipping from October of that same year, its headline reading, "Vandalism." One page authorizes the act, the other immortalizes the regret. And between them lies the brief, irreversible moment when culture recognized what bureaucracy had already forgotten, the exact second when the cost of silence exceeded the cost of scandal. By 1965, the city had transformed its embarrassment into legislation. The Landmarks Preservation Commission, once a symbol of impotence, now possessed enforceable authority under the newly signed landmarks law. But real power brings its own disguises, and what begins as moral correction often ends as procedure. Between 1965 and 1970, New York learned how to manage its own shame. The outrage that followed the demolition of Penn Station did not end in reform. It hardened into routine. The language of administration absorbed what emotion had exposed. Terms like demolition and loss quietly disappeared from official correspondence, replaced by a new vocabulary of neutrality: redevelopment, requalification, adaptation, maintenance. Each word performed a small act of amnesia. The city did not need to deny what had happened. It only needed to rename it. In that linguistic shift, preservation itself became a department, and grief became paperwork. For the first time, heritage could be processed like a budget line. The Landmarks Preservation Commission, LPC, began issuing designations, holding hearings, and producing reports. These actions created an impression of vigilance, but they also produced distance. What had once been lived as scandal was now managed as docket. Every building at risk of demolition became a case file. Every loss became a procedural outcome. By reducing emotion to category, the city learned to control the scale of its own regret. The action here is deceptively simple: the institutionalization of silence. Once preservation was codified, dissent became easier to domesticate. A resident protesting a redevelopment was no longer an accuser of power. They were a participant in process. They could be invited to a hearing, given time to speak, thanked for their contribution, and overruled within the same framework that had just validated their presence. The effect was subtle but devastating. Outrage no longer needed to be suppressed. It could be scheduled. Inside City Hall, memos from this era show how decisions were now packaged in administrative language designed to minimize perception of conflict. Instead of destroyed, officials wrote cleared. Instead of erased, they wrote replaced. And instead of failed to preserve, they wrote evaluated but not designated. The city no longer appeared to forget. It simply framed remembering as something already completed. The Landmarks Law of 1965 achieved its technical purpose. It prevented another Penn Station-level loss, but it also taught institutions how to neutralize accountability. By the late 1960s, preservation had become an instrument of governance rather than of conscience. Bureaucrats could point to a functioning system, while the deeper question, how a civic threshold could vanish without collective resistance, remained unanswered. The city had found equilibrium not in truth, but in management. The narrator walks through this transformation step by step, tracing how the very mechanisms designed to prevent silence ended up perfecting it. A commission that once lacked authority now had procedures so refined that individual decisions disappeared inside them. Meetings produced minutes. Minutes produced summaries. Summaries became archives, and archives became the new resting place for outrage. When the process is perfect, the emotion it was meant to contain can no longer escape. By 1970, this normalization was visible in the tone of public communication. Civic losses were no longer treated as moral questions but as management challenges. Adaptive reuse, urban renewal, and redevelopment strategy became interchangeable expressions, each suggesting continuity while ensuring removal. The vocabulary was so polished that citizens began to internalize it. When a historic facade came down, the language softened the impact before the dust settled. The consequence was not indifference, but sedation. The public still knew that Penn Station had been lost. Every newspaper, every textbook reminded them. But that knowledge no longer pointed to anyone. Responsibility dissolved across agencies, councils, commissions, and committees. The tragedy acquired the structure of a process: reviewed, discussed, archived, and officially concluded. The absence of guilt became indistinguishable from the presence of order. The LPC itself reflected this paradox. In hearings from the late 1960s, commissioners debated not beauty or heritage, but criteria and jurisdiction. The language of art gave way to the language of compliance. Even the victories, the saved facades, the landmark districts, were framed in cautious administrative prose. A city that once watched its own temple fall now measured dignity in forms and filings. What had been an open wound turned into a checklist of precedents. This, finally, is what normalization looks like. Not forgetting, but the formal management of memory. A city that learned to preserve could also learn to conceal behind procedure. The civic voice that once cried vandalism learned to say redevelopment, and by doing so, made the loss seem civil. The system did not kill outrage, it embalmed it. The narrator ends this block inside an archive room, describing rows of labeled boxes. Penn Station hearings, 1963-1965. Landmarks Law Implementation, 1966-1970. Each folder contains documents written in careful, neutral prose. No anger, no grief, only the evidence of process. One label catches. The camera's light, case closed. It is the quietest phrase in government, and the one that proves how well the city learned to normalize its own silence. In 2023, the name Penn Station still functions less as a place than as an unresolved argument. Every few years, New York City promises to fix it. Plans are unveiled, renderings circulate, agencies hold hearings, but the structure that defines the city's daily transit remains largely unchanged. What endures is not incompetence, but inheritance. A design of interlocked powers created between 1954 and 1963, when the logic of redevelopment fused property, infrastructure, and narrative into a single, self-reinforcing system. The Madison Square Garden, MSG, sitting directly atop the station, is the clearest symbol of that interlock. Built as the financial justification for demolishing the original terminal, it now stands as the obstacle to any meaningful repair. The city cannot move forward without confronting it, yet removing or relocating it would reopen every buried question about ownership, revenue, and control that has remained dormant for 6 decades. The ghost of the original deal still dictates the shape of the modern debate. In 2023, the rhetoric surrounding the Penn District redevelopment plan repeats the same vocabulary born out of that first transformation. Revitalization, public benefit, mixed-use integration. The words are different masks for the same negotiation. How much of the public realm can be surrendered to private leverage in exchange for improvement that never quite arrives? Each announcement sounds like progress. Each deferral feels like déjà vu. What is being tested is not architecture, but the endurance of a civic paradox. The narrator treats the present as an audit rather than an update. Standing in the concourse during rush hour, the scene is a physical record of bureaucratic legacy. The ceilings remain low because the roof above belongs to another entity. The circulation feels compressed because the station was never rebuilt, only buried. And the disorientation passengers feel daily is not an accident of design. It is the material expression of divided authority. Every beam and corridor tells the same story. This is what compromise looks like when it becomes permanent. The action at the heart of this block is an examination of what still cannot be explained convincingly to the public. After billions in studies, proposals, and hearings, Penn Station continues to function as a bottleneck, efficient only on spreadsheets. Why, in a city capable of engineering skyscrapers and tunnels, does its most vital gateway remain claustrophobic? The answer is structural in the political sense. Touching one part of the system means disturbing all others. To fix Penn requires renegotiating air rights, rezoning parcels, confronting MSG's lease, and recalibrating the balance of influence among city, state, and private developers. The cost of action has become higher than the discomfort of delay. That cost is not only financial, it is institutional. The agencies responsible for the station, city planning, state transit authorities, private landlords, operate within a web of agreements designed to avoid clear ownership of failure. Every public hearing becomes a theater of mutual caution. Officials speak of coordination, stakeholder input, incremental improvement. These are the same protective words that replaced guilt after 1965. They signal concern without consequence. The silence that once followed the demolition has evolved into a language of deferral. The Landmarks Preservation Commission, which owes its existence to the original loss, appears in this story again, but now as a spectator. Its authority stops at the perimeter of the current structure. It cannot preserve what was already erased. The irony is complete. The very institution born from outrage has no jurisdiction over the object of its creation. Its survival proves the lesson of Penny. Stations fall, the city can enshrine memory and still live comfortably with its absence. What remains today is a kind of civic stalemate disguised as progress. Every administration since the 1990s has promised transformation. Each has commissioned new renderings, environmental reviews, and financial partnerships. Yet the core experience for the commuter in 2023 remains the same: narrow corridors, artificial light, and the sense of descending rather than arriving. The physical discomfort mirrors the psychological weight of decisions made long before anyone now in office was born. The narrator's tone stays investigative, not nostalgic. The point is not to mourn, but to trace continuity. The very logic that justified demolition, revenue over ritual, utility over presence, still governs redevelopment. The new Penn exists as an idea precisely because the old one was sacrificed to the belief that the city could always rebuild later. The later has arrived, but the machinery that enabled the loss still defines what rebuilding means. The consequence is clear. Institutional decisions have half-lives longer than any single generation. What New York confronts in 2023 is not the ruin of Penn Station, but the persistence of its rationale. The station's discomfort is the visible residue of an ideology that valued throughput over experience, profit over proportion, and narrative control over civic memory. The block closes on a single present-day image. A commuter steps off the morning train, glances upward, and sees not sky but a grid of fluorescent panels. Above that grid sits the Madison Square Garden, its foundations resting on what was once open air. Somewhere between the commuter's footsteps and the arena's floor lies the invisible layer of 1963, a deal still alive, still binding, still shaping how the city moves and how it remembers. There is another way to test the inheritance in 2023, and it has nothing to do with renderings. Ask a simpler question: when something goes wrong. At Penn Station, crowding, delays, confusing wayfinding, who precisely is supposed to feel accountable? The answer is rarely a single name. It is a chain of agencies, property interests, and overlapping jurisdictions that can each claim partial responsibility and, in practice, full insulation. That diffusion is not an accident of modern governance. It is the long shadow of the original bargain. Keep the trains moving, keep the revenue flowing, and let the lived experience become negotiable. East 2023, the station sits at the intersection of competing mandates that do not naturally align. One mandate is operational. Move hundreds of thousands of people through a constrained footprint with minimal disruption. Another is developmental. Treat the district as a platform for economic output. New offices, new towers, new tax base. A third is political. Avoid a failure so visible that it defines an administration. Each mandate produces a different solution, and when those solutions collide, the safest path becomes incrementalism. Small upgrades can be announced. Big structural moves require confronting the interlock at the center of the site. That interlock is not only MSG as a physical object, it is MSG as a legal and financial arrangement embedded into the station's geometry. The building above functions like a ceiling on ambition. Any plan that proposes a dramatic increase in volume, light, and legibility must either work around the arena or imagine relocating it, an action that triggers negotiations across money, permits, politics, and time. In 2023, the debate often circles that reality without naming it directly. Officials speak about reimagining the district while carefully avoiding the one element that determines how much can truly be reimagined. The result is a peculiar pattern in public planning. The station is treated as if it can be fixed through surface improvements, better signage, cleaner corridors, new entrances, while the root constraints remain untouched. Those interventions are not meaningless, but they reveal the underlying fear. If the core problem is structural, low ceilings, fragmented circulation, competing owners, then the true remedy would require a reallocation of power. And in New York, power is rarely surrendered, it is traded. The cost of the trade is what makes concertor Penn politically expensive. The present-day dispute also exposes how modern public messaging replaces the old silence. In the 1960s, institutional actors minimized idea controversy by using technical language and proceeding through contracts. In 2023, controversy is managed through communication cycles: announce, consult, revise, promise a next phase. Each cycle produces a momentary sense of motion, even when the commuter's daily experience remains largely the same. The public sees activity, and activity becomes a substitute for resolution. This is the contemporary form of procedural quiet, not hiding the debate, but stretching it so long that urgency becomes fatigue. Another layer of the impasse is financial credibility. Any serious transformation must answer a question that Penn Station's history makes uncomfortable. Who pays, and who captures the value created? Redevelopment proposals tend to rely on the premise that private development can subsidize public infrastructure. That premise is the direct descendant of the air rights logic that began the chain in the 1950s. It is not inherently corrupt, but it is structurally risky because it ties the success of public space to private incentives. If a project's funding depends on towers, then the tower becomes the priority. The station becomes the justification. The city has lived this pattern before. In 2023, the memory of that pattern makes every new promise feel conditional. The station also functions as a stage for political conflict between levels of government. City planning priorities, state transit imperatives, regional commuter needs, and private property rights do not move at the same speed. When they disagree, the station becomes a place where coordination is praised and responsibility is deferred. A governor can promise decisive action, a mayor can demand public benefit, agencies can cite constraints, and private stakeholders can insist on their rights. Each statement can be true. Together, they can still produce paralysis. This is what institutional half-life looks like in real time. A decision made decades ago continues to shape what is politically feasible today. The most revealing evidence in 2023 is not a document. It is behavior. Watch what the public has learned to accept. People do not expect Penn Station to feel like a civic room. They expect it to function like a funnel. They plan for discomfort the way earlier generations planned for weather. They build extra minutes into their commute not because trains are always late, but because the station itself is unpredictable. Its choke points, its turns, its sudden compressions of crowd. That adaptation is a form of normalization more powerful than any official statement. It quietly lowers the bar for what the city believes it owes its residents. And yet the ambition to repair it keeps returning, because the station's centrality makes the failure impossible to fully ignore. Penn is not a side project. It is the gateway through which the city's labor force and regional identity pass every day. In 2023, that creates a trap. The station is too important to leave untouched, but too entangled to rebuild cleanly. Political leaders are forced to choose between modest wins that can be delivered within a term and structural fights that might outlive their careers. The historic logic of Penn Station, short-term solutions favored over long-term civic form, reasserts itself in a modern key. This extension ends with a concrete present-day test that does not require expertise. Stand still for 1 minute in the main concourse during peak flow and look for a single unbroken line of sight to an exit. That feels obvious. What you will see instead is a landscape of instructions, arrows, boards, temporary barriers, and human currents that pull you more than guide you. Above it all, the weight of the arena remains unmoving, not as a villain, but as a fact that limits every plan. And that is the unresolved tension the present inherits. In 2023, the city can describe a better Penn Station in public, but the moment it tries to build it, it must decide which power structure it is willing to confront and which compromises it is willing to repeat. And so the record closes the way institutions prefer it to close, not with a confession, but with a sequence of authorizations that, taken one by one, appear ordinary. 1910 gave New York a monument that performed civic dignity as effortlessly as light entering a vaulted hall. 1954 translated that dignity into a negotiable instrument: air above stone, value above presence. 1962 hardened the translation into a public promise, drafted in the language of necessity. 1963 made the promise physical, the first cut turning architecture into inventory. And 1965, after the dust had already settled into the city's lungs, delivered the formal remedy, the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the law that followed, like a seal applied to a wound that had already been inflicted. This is the moral pattern Penn Station leaves behind, and it is colder than any scandal. Cities do not lose history the way they lose an artifact to fire or flood. They authorize loss, quietly, professionally, until the absence feels like the only outcome that ever made sense. The Pennsylvania Railroad did not need to declare war on memory. It only needed to reclassify a landmark as a platform for revenue. New York City did not need to announce surrender. It only needed to allow contracts to outrun conscience. And once a deadline is set, once a lease is signed, once a schedule is published, the public is invited to mistake momentum for inevitability. In the archival corridors where these decisions still sleep, the evidence is rarely dramatic. It is stamped, filed, and phrased in neutral terms that dissolve moral weight. Redevelopment, maintenance, modernization. The power is not hidden, it is camouflaged as administration. A folder is closed, a hearing is logged, a designation is granted elsewhere. The institution walks away not as a villain, but as a manager who claims the work was necessary. Yet the most enduring proof is not in the paper. It is in the living discomfort that remains central, daily, unquestioned, an architectural consequence that outlasts the people who signed their names. Penn Station, as it exists now, is not merely a station. It is an heirloom of a decision structure. Property above, infrastructure below, narrative wrapped around both. And every attempt to fix it inherits the same dilemma. Touch one element, and you awaken the entire bargain. Somewhere in that chain, air rights in 1954, the announcement in 1962, the first cut in 1963, there's a moment where history was not simply altered, but rewritten into procedure. If you had to point to a single instant when the city crossed from preservation into permission, was it the contract, the announcement, or the first cut? And why? If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And remain with us. Subscribe so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Because Penn Station was never only one building. It was a method, and if you are willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.